Shields tend to be a little bit more involved in Pathfinder than other similar game systems like D&D-5e, as they're really activators for abilities rather than a passive item that others may be accustomed to. So, this video will be a guide to how shields work in the rules, and then advice on how to build around shields in the second half of this video. So, for now, let's start with the question, what is a shield? To begin this explanation, let's start with the steel shield, which is just the default shield that people normally think about. It is an item that requires a hand, and lets you spend an action to use the raise shield action, giving yourself a +2 circumstance bonus to armor class. Now, positive bonuses in Pathfinder are stronger than other equivalent systems because it is increasing your chance to have attacks miss you and decreasing your chance to get crit. So it is both affecting your chance of getting crit and your chance of getting hit, meaning it is helping you in two ways. So roughly, if you're coming from D&D 5, you should think of a +1 or +2 in this system as twice as valuable. And as such, those bonuses are more tightly controlled, which is why you then need to spend that extra resource, that action, to raise it. Now, you then have the smaller option, the buckler, which it's still the same 1 action cost to raise it, but it only gives a +1 bonus, and its hardness value is a little bit lesser, which does matter when it comes to blocking with it, but if you don't have shield block, that doesn't matter. And the benefit of using a buckler over a steel shield is that you can still use that hand for other things potentially. You can still hold a potion. As long as it is not a weapon, you can realistically still hold in that hand and have the buckler there. So it is a nice little option to have if you're naturally a character that has that kind of open hand. Tower shields are the big bulky version of these. They come with a speed penalty, they're super heavy at 4 bulk, they cost 10 gold compared to the 2 of the other shield, and it is a lot. It lets you spend another action after you've raised shield to take cover, bring that bonus up to +4, so it effectively is more shield for your shield. That +4 bonus is absolutely gargantuan massive. It can let you break the 30 AC barrier at level 6. It is nuts. It will let you get to wherever you need to be defensively, as long as you're burning 2 of your 3 actions on hiding behind it. And that's really one of the big downsides of tower shields and shields in general, is that you need to spend actions in order to use their effect. The effect is likely worth it, especially when you consider things like the multi-attack penalty that discourage just attacking every single one of your actions, and raising a shield will just always be there as a solid option. So, now that we have an understanding of what shields do, let's go into some augments that you can do onto your shield. And by augments, I mean the things that you would attach to the front of the shield. And this is usually a spike or the item known as shield augment. And when you have a shield boss or a shield spike, it turns your shield from a D4 martial weapon to a D6 martial weapon of either bludgeoning or piercing, depending on if it was a boss or a spike. Very simple. If you plan to be attacking with your shield as a weapon, whether a primary or an off weapon, it can be a good idea to get the boss or the spike. Now, if you do not plan to attack with the shield, I would highly recommend getting a shield augment, because then you can put traits on it, such as disarm and trip, which let you do those associated maneuvers despite not having an open hand, which gives you a little bit of extra utility on a character that has a hand consumed by a shield, gives them more variety in what they can do with their actions, and it's overall really nice. But it is uncommon, so that means you will have to ask your GM if you can buy it or start with it, or they might be a quest reward and adventure, but uncommon does not mean more powerful, it just means rare in the world. Ask your GM if you can have it. Now, shield block is a little bit more complicated, and I think part of that is due to the wording and it having rules that go to all over the book. So, let's say, for example, you have a steel shield and you block an attack that has 9 damage coming into you. The steel shield hardness is 5, so you reduce the damage of the attack by 5. There's now 4 damage left over. You take that 4 damage, and your shield takes that leftover 4 damage. So your shield will be now at 16 HP rather than its full 20. Makes sense? Cool. There are shields that will have higher hardness values, more HP, etc., etc. And the reason you'd want to invest in those is so you can keep on shield blocking way into the later stages of the game when attacks are starting to come in for things like 70. And you do not want your shield to just be, oh, I block 5 and it crumples like a piece of tissue paper. Getting those shield upgrades is necessary if you want to be using shield block, but it is absolutely not necessary if you do not plan on using shield block or do not have the general feat to shield block, because not every class gets access to shield block from level 1 for free. Fighters and champions are two of the big ones that do, but if you're playing something like a monk, you're not going to have shield block without investing that general feat. So, what shield block does is it reduces the incoming damage by the shield's hardness. For the steel shield, that's 5. For wooden shield, that's 3. For various magical shields, it's various different numbers. It is always listed on the shield as H whatever. Now, there's another number on that shield being the broken threshold. The broken threshold is at half of its HP. And when it is broken, it is no longer usable. You cannot raise it. You cannot block with it. It is effectively broken. You cannot use it. However, if it gets that second number where the 20 is on the steel shield, then it is not just broken, it is destroyed and it cannot be repaired without just making a new one. Now, if a shield breaks, you can still retrieve its augment or its boss or whatever from the shield because that did not break. And that does matter if you decide to put weapon runes on your shield boss or anything like that. But at the same time, you probably are putting a lot of gold into that shield if you are actively shield blocking with it. So I would highly recommend just taking the attack to the chin if it would destroy the shield. So, there's also one other funny interaction when it comes to shield block, and that is the order you apply resistance and weakness to it, because you actually apply the weakness or resistance first in the rules as written, because if you read the dealing damage step in the rules guide, you'll see that resistance and weakness comes in the figuring out how much damage you take step, which happens before you decide to use shield block. So, as such, if you have something like a weakness to slashing damage because you're a zombie or whatever, and you're a zombie monster with a shield, your shield block from that actually will be taking more damage, because the weakness is not just damage you're taking, it's the damage overall that then, it's a whole thing. And this does matter for a specific feat in Champion that comes way later in the game, and it is usually in the player's favor because not that many enemies are shielding and shield blocking along with resistances. The only ones I can really think of are like skeleton champions. So that's that, but that's a silly little rules interaction. I'll leave a link to in the description to how it's played because I think they have a really, really good in-depth video on the topic. Of course, the first thing to consider when you decide to make a character with a shield is, how are you going to have that shield and still be useful? So, for spellcaster shield users, that's easy. You can still cast spells, even if both hands are full. So, spellcasters do not need to worry about the handedness. Same thing with characters that specialize in unarmed attacks, because even a kick uses the same stats as a fist, and a lot of strikes simply say, you then gain the ability to make this type of strike. For example, a lot of the monk feats will just say, you take a stance that has you do this with your hands, but they do not specify you must strike with those hands. And there are some feats that specify you do strike with a certain part of the body. For example, the dragon stance in monk specifies that you strike with a kick. And you'd be pretty hard pressed to argue that your null claw attack also applies to a headbutt. That being said, things like a bite also don't require an open hand, so your lizard folk are going to have a great time. If you are a martial character that is not using one of those unarmed strikes, you're going to be limited to one-handed weapons, which is fine. You're losing about 2 damage per damage die on average, so if you have a striking rune, you're losing 4 damage on average, because that's the difference between longsword and greatsword. D12 versus D8 maximum of damage that you can deal with a weapon of that handedness. In my opinion, that's not that big of a loss if your class has a way to supplement that damage. For example, a class like Barbarian has Rage, and I have an entire video over here about how damage could mean different things to different builds, and I noted that classes that have big bonuses to damage actually don't need to have every little thing giving them as much damage as possible because they're already fine. So as such, Barbarian Shield user actually makes a lot of sense. But you do run into issues if you're a thing like a fighter or a champion to put out that threat level, to put out that damage, and so that needs to be an extra consideration if you are planning to give up damage in order to use a shield. The next issue with shields is the action economy usage, because it does take an action whenever you actually want to use this. Now, mind you, Fighter has some feats to get around this, let them raise it as a reaction, but for the most part, most characters will need to spend an action to raise their shield. So in their combat flow pattern, you need to find some downtime mid-combat to where that shield can rise. And if you're a simpler martial character, that's pretty easy. When you have that multi-attack penalty stacked up to -10 because you've attacked 2 other times in that turn, well, that -10 attack probably is going to hit anyway, so you might as well make them less likely to hit you and set up for the ability to shield block. Makes sense. However, if you're a spellcaster, you then need to decide, am I actually in danger? Do I need to raise this shield? Or would I be better off moving Recalling Knowledge? Now, the martial characters have that consideration as well, but they also tend to have lower mental stats, so their third action activities tend to be weaker than the caster third action activities due to that mental stat difference. And also, I mentioned before that shields can be used as weapons, particularly with the boss or the spikes make them a D6 weapon. That's only 1 die size lower than the optimal one-handed weapon. So you can make a good case for dual wielding with a shield, especially if you're something like a ranger that wants to make a lot of attacks in turn. You lead with the shield hand, and then you're offhand with an agile weapon. So if you're using a shield and a short sword, you can make great use of like all of the dual wielding feats, despite having a shield strapped to one hand. But again, if you're planning on doing this with a fighter, you're going to run issues if needing to pick a weapon group at level 5 to progress to master while everything else stays at expert. But even if you're something like a ruffian rogue, for example, that shield boss is a D6 martial weapon, so you can actually sneak attack with it as a rogue, which is really interesting. So shielder rogue with a short sword is actually a pretty viable character here in Pathfinder. And I was just talking to a guy on Discord the other day, and we came up with the idea for a dual class character that involved a ranger putting runes on the shield boss and then using doubling rings, so that way you could draw whatever other one-handed weapons you want that have various poisons applied to them, and then have them copy the runes from the shield boss, to then have a weapon-swapping dual wielder character by just having the runes hang out on the shield and then come onto the off weapon when needed. There's some really interesting stuff you can do with dual wielding tech, and shields give you a thing to do once you rack up a higher multi-attack penalty. If your class doesn't naturally have access to a lot of things fighter does for dual wielding, that increase your defenses. That being said, if you're not dual wielding, you likely have a better weapon in that other hand, and so you're probably never going to be attacking with your shield. And that's why I recommend Shield Augment for those people. And Shield Augment lets you tone down your damage die to get more traits. And my favorite 2 traits to pick are Trip and Disarm, because Disarm was just buffed in the remaster, and both these things apply a further penalty to enemies hitting, because when you're prone, you have a -2 circumstance penalty to hit. Same thing if you are disarmed. On a success. On a critical success, they just lose the weapon, but on a successful disarm or trip, they have a penalty until they spend actions to get rid of that. And if you have Reactive Strike, or another feat that lets you react to a manipulate, them reaffirming their grip or standing up are move or manipulates respectively. So you can actually then get reactions off on them after debuffing them and still be protecting yourself with that shield. So then you have this thing of, do I shield block or do I go for the reactive strike? I say generally, going for a full accuracy strike is better than the damage reduction from a shield block, but that's a rule of thumb that can be adjusted, because a lot of the time that shield block is easier to get off than the reactive strike. But that does come into an interesting issue. If you have too many reactions, and only one reaction to use them on, you're gonna run into issues of enemies baiting your reaction by having you use other things. So you have the ability to react to a lot of things and always use that reaction, but you need to be careful of where you spend it. So it becomes really tactical what you're doing outside of your turn, which I think is really interesting gameplay-wise, but other people may find frustrating. So I'm going to label that out here as something that might be an issue, particularly if you are a champion or a fighter that naturally have a very strong reaction. With bucklers, it can be a lot harder to justify that full action of raising it, and for a martial player to justify giving up that hand for it, and for casters not just use the shield cantrip or the glass shield cantrip instead. That still gives the +1 AC bonus, but comes with shield block instead of that being another feat, another piece of gear they need to upgrade. So bucklers are hard to justify unless you have direct synergy feats, such as a swashbuckler. But it wouldn't be me if I didn't come up with some spicy tech, and in this case that is, bows are labeled as 1+ hands, not 2 hands. So that means you technically have a free hand whenever you are not actively shooting. So therefore, you can raise a buckler after you're done making all your shots and say, hey, hand's empty, I'm not using a weapon in that hand. And you're completely within the rules to get that +1 armor class bonus. And I know a lot of range characters can have issues with not knowing to do that third action. So for them having a defensive action that they can always fall back on is really nice. So yeah, there's my little secret buckler tech. Tower shields and how to make them work almost deserves its own video. And I'm just going to go over the Spark Notes version of that now. First off, at level 1, if you're playing a heavy armor character with a tower shield, you are going to be at 8 bulk from there already. You have another weapon that's 9, that is your max carrying capacity until level 10. Unless you have the skill feat Hefty Hauler that gives you 2 extra bulk to carry. That'll be enough for your backpack. Because now we are splitting hairs over can you carry your own backpack. That is the degree of bulk limits that you are going to be imposing on yourself using a tower shield. So I'd recommend Brewer type background that gives you the Hefty Hauler skill feat right at level 1 if you want to use it there. It is also 10 gold, so it's a big strain on your starting equipment, particularly if you're having to pitch in for the group's healer's tools at the early game. It can be rough. And it also comes with the speed penalty. Now, there are some ways to get around the speed penalty, like if you are a dwarf, you can get Unburdened Iron and actually reduce that speed penalty. If you are a monk, you can just have enough bonus speed to where it doesn't matter. And you could just simply know that your game involves a lot of tight corners and dungeons where there are thin alleyways that you can use the tower shield and have everybody hide behind you. That just makes it worth it on its own. However, it also has the other issue of it's even more strenuous on your action economy. And you do not need to fully raise and hide behind it each turn, but otherwise you should be using a steel shield unless it's a main plan you tend to go for. At least in my opinion. So, in order to get around that, you usually want to have a way to put a lot of damage or a lot of threat in that last remaining action. So I really do think that something like Monk Flurry of Blows is a good choice. And maybe if you go lighter on the equipment, like say if you were playing a monk and were able to go lighter on equipment because you don't need armor, you can then get rid of that like bulk needing anyway. But, you know, they tend to be worse at shield blocking because there aren't sturdy tower shields. Because sturdy items are like specific things and, you know. But if you're a monk and you don't plan on shield blocking anyway, you know, using a tower shield can be really good. But, you know, everybody kind of knows about the monk tower shield thing. That's kind of like really base level. So now I'm going to hit you with 2 other spicers. So, first spicer, sniper gunslinger that carries their own cover. Because the sniper gunslinger special reload action actually allows them to take cover or hide. And when you have that tower shield raised, you are actually using the hard named action, take cover. So, As such, you can take cover behind your own tower shield as a sniping vantage point, which is really cool, and I'm not going to let anybody take that away from me. My second spicy take is putting it on a class that's already pretty action intensive, and that is slapping it onto a Magus of Laughing Shadow variety. Because they can then use their mobility from teleports to get in places. If they were to go for like the strength medium armor thing, they don't really want to go into heavy armor anyway, so that saves them a little bit of that bulk capacity there. And then they can just start smacking people with this shield with the open hand. And there's probably something there for giving them a defensive mode against creatures that have reactive strike, so that they aren't reliant on that spell strike and can instead start to be a tank, which is really interesting and a different take on that class that I haven't really seen before. So, yeah. I could also see some characters like some bards really take advantage of this and use their composition cantrip of whatever type they want to use, and then use the tower shield to keep themselves protected, so that way they can keep on doing that and are very safe in the middle of everything, and then always have that option to go back just casting spells like normal if the need arises. So, yeah, can be good there as well for a class that doesn't really need to be mobile to get value, doesn't need those sight lines, etc., etc. I also want to discuss the value of the shield block reaction as a general feat before I hop off here, because it is a general feat you can take as early as level 1 if you're a human, or level 3 because that's when the first general feat comes for everybody that isn't human, because humans are good. And so, as such, we should evaluate it as a defensive general feat that you invest in. And, of course, the closest comparison that I can come up with is toughness. Toughness, of course, gives you HP equal to your level and a little rider bonus for dying checks. So, as such, we should compare what shield block gives you to that. So at level 3, when most characters gain access and you just have a normal steel shield, using shield block once in a fight heals you for about 5 HP through the damage it's mitigating. Maybe there's one more thing you need to repair out of combat, but that's easy enough. If one person has quick repair, they get to make 10 attempts to repair it. Not really an issue. So, as such, we can treat it as if it heals you for 5 when you use the reaction. So if you don't normally have a reaction, well, it's already 2 better than toughness when you're only using it once in a fight. But you can use it 2 to maybe even 3 times in a single fight, even at those early levels, effectively multiplying your character's HP by 1.5 times. That's really good as a general feat. And would I take it over fleet? If I'm planning on using a shield and I want to have the shield be a core part of my character, and I don't have a reaction already, it is, in my opinion, the best general feat in the game, if I'm already having a shield and I'm fine with upgrading it. And if I'm not planning on upgrading that shield, I'll probably still take it for the early game, and then just, if it works out that I can upgrade the shield, do that, and it'll still probably be better than toughness. But at that point, it's a maybe, because I really, really like fleet and that plus 5 movement speed bonus. Because that 5 movement speed can get my character from 25 to 30, which is the difference between 10 and 15 feet in difficult terrain. So that's the difference between being able to walk 2 diagonal tiles off a single stride or not being able to do that in difficult terrain. And that's the break point for me personally and the stuff that I'm looking for. I want to make sure that my move speed is at least 30 a lot of the time, so I tend to do some wacky things in order to get there. But if you want a video on move speed, let me know that down below. And I think that's the end of my notes on shields. I'll leave a pinned comment if I forgot anything. And yeah, have a good one.